The gun went off at 2:47 in the morning, and by 3:03, Kang So-jun was bleeding through his shirt in the back of a black SUV that moved through Seoul like a ghost. No sirens, no lights, just speed and silence, and the understanding that men like him did not go to hospitals. The alley behind Itaewon's underground clinic was slick with rain when they dragged him through the metal door, and the first thing he saw when the fluorescent light hit his eyes was a woman who did not flinch. Adeze Okonkwo had been awake for 19 hours straight. She had a dried coffee stain on the left sleeve of her scrubs. Her braids were pinned up in a way that suggested she'd done it with one hand while reading a chart, and when the men burst through her door with their guns half drawn and their boss half dead, she looked at them the way she looked at everything, like a problem she'd already begun solving. "Get him on the table. Everyone else out." One of the men, thick-necked, tattooed to the jaw, stepped forward. "We stay." She turned to look at him with the particular patience of a woman who had worked trauma wards in Lagos, who had seen men die from things they thought couldn't kill them, who understood that authority had very little to do with how loud you spoke. "You can stay in this room and contaminate my sterile field, or you can stand outside that door and be useful. Your choice. But he loses more blood every second you spend deciding." They left. Kang So-jun watched her from the table with the careful attention of a man who had survived 38 years by reading rooms and the people in them. He read her. She wasn't afraid, not performing bravery, not the brittle, trembling kind of courage his men sometimes showed when they thought he wasn't watching, but genuinely, quietly unafraid. She cut open his shirt with the same efficiency she would have used on anyone, pressed gloved fingers against the wound without ceremony and said, "This is a through and through. You were lucky. Hold still." "I know who you are," he said, his voice even despite the pain. The way his voice was always even. It was something he had practiced for years. Evenness, control, the performance of a man who felt nothing, because men who felt nothing were difficult to threaten. She didn't look up. "I know who you are too. It doesn't change what I'm doing." He said nothing. No one had ever said that to him before. He came back 6 weeks later. There was no wound. He stood in the doorway of the clinic at a time when she happened to be alone, and he looked at her the way powerful men look at things they do not understand, with a wariness that almost resembled respect. He had a bottle of expensive scotch in his hand, which was his version of not knowing what to bring, and she looked at it, looked at him, and said, "I don't drink on shift." "You're alone." "That doesn't mean I'm off shift." He set the bottle down on the counter anyway, and sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited. She let him, not because she was afraid to tell him to leave, he understood that already, but because something in her posture said she was curious. Clinically, the way she might be curious about an unusual presentation. "How long have you been in Seoul?" he asked. 3 years? Before? Lagos, FMC Abute Meta, Trauma Unit. She didn't ask him anything back, not right away, and that silence did something to the air between them. He was accustomed to people filling silences around him, nervously, eagerly. People who wanted things from him or feared him too much to be quiet in his presence. She just worked, writing notes in the chart open on her desk, and the silence she left was the kind that didn't demand anything from him, so he sat in it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he sat in a silence that didn't feel like pressure, and he did not know what to do with that. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, still writing. He had an answer prepared. He always had answers prepared. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was the truth, quiet and unguarded. "I don't know." She looked up at him then, not surprised. She was rarely surprised, but paying attention in a new way. She set down her pen. "That's the most honest thing you've said since you walked through that door." He came back again, and again. He started coming in the late hours when the clinic was quiet, bringing food he had no reason to know she preferred. Jollof rice from the one Nigerian restaurant in Mapogu, pepper soup on cold nights, and she accepted these things without making much of them, which he found disorienting in the best possible way. Every other person in his life made much of everything he gave. It was how power worked. You gave, and they performed gratitude until the gratitude became a leash. Adeze just said, "Thank you," and ate and asked him things. She asked him things no one asked. Not about his territory, not about his rivals, not about the money or the fear or the architecture of the empire he had spent 15 years constructing from nothing. She asked him what he was like before. She asked him once, quietly, looking at the scar on his left hand that was too old and too deliberate to be accidental. "Who did that?" He went very still. "It doesn't matter." "It clearly does." He stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, Seoul glittered and hummed, indifferent and enormous, and he stood with his back to her for a long moment, feeling something move in him that he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it was dead. Then he said, without turning around, "My father, when I was 11, I stole food because we hadn't eaten in 3 days, and he said it was shameful to be caught, that suffering was fine but weakness was not." He paused. "I decided that night that I would never be in a position where I needed anything from anyone. I've kept that promise." The room was quiet. Then she said, gently but without softness for softness's sake, "That's not a promise. That's a prison sentence." He turned around. She was looking at him with the expression he had come to recognize as her particular form of honesty. Not cruel, not pitying, just clear. Like a clean window. And something in his chest cracked open approximately 1 millimeter, which was the most it had opened in 27 years. The crisis came on a Thursday in November. One of his lieutenants had been talking to a rival faction, months of quiet betrayal finally surfacing in bloodshed, and the fallout was swift and structural and required the version of Kang So-jun that the city knew. Cold, decisive, merciless. He handled it the way he handled everything, efficiently, without sentiment. He made an example of what disloyalty produced, and by Friday morning, Seoul's criminal landscape had been rearranged, and he was standing in her doorway at 4 in the morning, with clean hands but something terrible in his eyes. She took one look at him and said, "Sit down. I don't need—" "I know what you need and what you think you need are two different things. Sit down, Seo-jun." No one used his given name like that. Like it was just a name, not a title, not a brand. He sat down. She brought him water and sat across from him and didn't ask what happened. She just looked at him, and he looked at her. And the thing he saw in her face was not judgment and not fear, and not the adoration that some people mistook for love. It was witnessing. She was just witnessing him, the whole of him. The version that had just done something terrible, and the version that had stolen food at 11 years old, and every version in between. She saw all of it, and she was still there. "I'm tired," he said. It was the first time he had said that to anyone. Not tired of specific things, tired in the bone-deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. "I know," she said. "I don't know how to stop. You do. You're just afraid of what's left if you do." He looked at her for a long time. "What's left?" She held his gaze steady. "You, just you, without all of this. And I think that's what terrifies you. Not that you'd be powerless, that you'd finally have to meet yourself." He started showing up differently after that. Not reformed. Life was not a drama where the dangerous man becomes gentle overnight and everyone cheers, but changed in texture. He laughed once, a real laugh, about something small and domestic, and the sound of it startled both of them. He told her about his mother. He told her about the first year in Seoul, when he slept in a shipping container in Incheon and ate convenience store kimbap, and told himself that this was temporary, that everything was temporary, that he would build something permanent if it destroyed him. She listened without interruption, and when he finished, she said, "You built something permanent. You just built the wrong thing." He asked her what she meant. "You built walls. Walls are permanent, but they keep everything out, including the things worth keeping." They were sitting close on the narrow clinic couch, her feet tucked under her, a half-eaten container of food between them. Outside, a November wind moved through the streets. He was looking at his hands, the scar on the left, the rings he wore because rings communicated something, the calluses that told the history of how he had arrived here. And she reached out and covered his hand with hers. Not dramatically, not with declaration, just quietly, the way you hold something you're not trying to possess. He didn't move. "You're not afraid of me," he said, still looking at their hands. "I'm not afraid of you. You should be. Maybe, but fear would stop me from seeing you clearly, and you need someone who can see you clearly. You've been surrounded by mirrors long enough. Everyone just reflecting back what you want them to. She squeezed his hand once. I'm not a mirror. He looked at her. The quality of his attention had changed over these months. It was less a threat assessment now, and more something raw, something that had no name in the language of Empire. What are you? She almost smiled. I'm a nurse. I deal with wounds. Some of them are just older than others. The night, everything broke open. It wasn't violence that caused it. It was a small thing. He arrived at the clinic and she was on the phone with someone. Her voice low and warm, in a way he recognized meant home, meant Lagos, meant something before him. And when she hung up, her eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone pressing something down. What is it? He asked. She shook her head. Nothing. My mother. She's not well. He sat down next to her. He didn't say sorry. He had never been good at sorry. It felt like a word other people had learned fluently while he was studying a different language. He said, "Tell me about her." And she did. She told him about her mother's kitchen that smelled like Uda and crayfish and something sweet and unnameable. She told him about the way her mother sang off key to high life records and didn't care. She told him about the argument they'd had before she left Nigeria, how her mother thought she was throwing herself away, leaving everything for a city that didn't need her, patching up men who made the world more broken, too stubborn to admit she needed to be needed. And as she talked, something shifted in her face, some careful composure softening, and he understood that she too carried things she didn't show, that the fearlessness he had taken for armor was actually something harder. It was grief that had been metabolized into purpose. She was here because she was running towards something, not away, but the running still cost her. He put his arm around her, clumsily, not the practiced gesture of a man who touched people easily, but the uncertain, earnest movement of a man doing something for the first time. She leaned into it. They stayed like that for a long time. Then she said, quietly into his shoulder, "You're different when no one's watching." "I know. That's the one I want to know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm not sure I know how to keep him." "You don't keep him. You choose him every day, over and over. That's what it means." He thought about that. About choosing. About the difference between the man he had constructed and the man underneath, and whether the distance between them was as permanent as he'd believed. About what it would cost to close that distance, not in money or power, those were the currencies he understood, but in the harder currency of vulnerability, of becoming visible to someone without the protection of everything he'd built. "If I were just a man," he said slowly, "nothing, no empire, no name, no fear, just a man, would you—" "Yes," she said before he finished. "I already am." Months passed. He began, quietly and without announcement, to change the shape of things. Not all at once. Power is not a light switch. But incrementally, strategically, the way he had built everything, deliberately, one piece at a time. He started moving money out of the empire's darkest structures. He started thinking about exit, about what came after. His men noticed that something in him had altered, that the coldness had a crack in it, and some of them trusted him less for it, and some of them trusted him more, and that division was information. Adeze did not ask him to change. That was the thing he returned to again and again. She had never asked. She had just seen him clearly and without performance, and in being seen, he had become unable to sustain the pretense. The truest version of himself had been there the whole time, surviving on almost nothing, and she had walked in and treated it like it was worth tending to. That was, he understood now, more frightening than any gun had ever been. He told her that one evening as Seoul's winter began to ease, and the city's streetlights turned the mist gold. They were walking, something he rarely did, too exposed, and she had her hands in her coat pockets, and the night was cold and bright. "You know what I realized?" "Tell me." "I built everything to feel safe. The reputation, the power, all of it. To make sure nothing could ever touch me the way things touched me when I was young. And then you walked in, and you weren't afraid, and something about that." He paused. A taxi moved through the street ahead, its red light blurring in the wet air. Something about being seen without the armor is the most unsafe I've ever felt. And also, the only time I've ever felt safe, she offered. He looked at her. Yes, she nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd long suspected. That's how it works. Real safety isn't the absence of threat. It's the presence of someone who knows all of you and stays. The walls you built, they kept threats out, but they kept that out too. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they faced each other on the quiet street, the city enormous and indifferent around them. And he said the thing he had been building toward for months, the thing that terrified him more profoundly than anything his enemies had ever threatened. I want to stay. Not the man I made, me. I want to try to be that man permanently. She looked at him for a long moment, not surprised, not performing emotion she didn't feel, just honest, clear, present. Then do it, she said simply. Be brave enough to be ordinary. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do. He took her hand. She let him, and they walked back into the gold-lit night, Seoul humming its enormous, indifferent song around them. And for the first time in his life, Kang Seo-jun felt not the safety of walls, but the safety of being known, which is, when you finally find it, the only safety that has ever meant anything at all. The empire he built to feel safe had almost cost him the only real safety he had ever found. He had been brave enough, just barely, to choose the man underneath. She had known he would. She had seen him from the beginning, not what he was, but what he was trying underneath everything to become. Everyone feared what he was. She only ever saw who he was trying not to be. In the end, he chose her version of him. It was the bravest thing he ever did.